All right, so welcome to my lecture on case structure and current events. The reason I'm kind of pushing for people's videos to be on is I would like to get your reaction because we are going to be talking about certain things that have been on the news and probably have impacted your life. And so I really want your input, and this is going to be something more of a discussion. For some of you who've done the Harper outreach, I did a small lecture there where I did ask a lot of questions. So don't be afraid. Critical debate is a way to debate that's unique mostly to LD and policy, but it's something that can be run in a lot of the other debates. One of the prerequisites for attending this lecture was attending the policy and LD lecture, but just note that if you haven't, that's totally fine. It was just more of a suggestion. So critical theory debate allows us to use the literature of critical theory, which is often more like academic literature that criticizes fundamental assumptions. So the K is actually German and it's social literary critique. I actually tried to look up a specific etymology online, but I wasn't able to, but I know that it comes from the German and that's kind of where the literature basis came from. So K debate, let's go on to the next slide. So before I get deep into how this applies to debate, I'm just going to say that K-debate is criticizing things that we don't usually criticize through debate. For example, a lot of debate is centered on policy arguments. We usually talk about this policy argument should pass and look at the impacts of us passing this health plan. But K-debate says something a little bit different. It says there's some things and implications of doing certain things that feed into, for example, affirming like capitalism or systems of oppression. So I will get a little bit more into that and how you can use it in the debate round. But first, I want to ask you guys, what were the biggest news stories of 2020, 2021? And then I'll share how you can make those into critiques. You can also say them loud or you can just type them in the chat. All right, so yeah, the Black Lives Matter has been erupting on social media especially. And so for those of you who have Instagram, I'm sure many of you have possibly posted personally. Yeah, there's a Ron. Oh, Kobe Bryant. Yeah, that was a big, I remember that. World War, okay. Wait, World War III? Right, okay. Yeah, we're still waiting for World War III with Iran. Yeah, tensions with Iran. There was I think I remember in history class they were even talking about people in our grade having to be drafted. Definitely women's rights. I think there was some definitely with the Supreme Court with Ruth Bader Ginsburg getting a lot older. Definitely police brutality. Brexit is an ongoing issue. We can keep them rolling a bit more. What were some other ones? Some of them that I have down is definitely the Black Lives Matter movement. In connection with COVID, we've seen talks about rise of anti-Asian sentiment. There's also been rising anti-Semitism too, which is disconnected from disagreements over Palestine and things, so that's separate. Definitely impeachment with Donald Trump. Okay, so these are all things that really factor in heavily, and these are all issues that many of us feel personally connected to, whether we know people who've gone out and protested, or whether we have actually, posted things on Instagram or signed petitions, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement. These are all things that have affected us deeply, and how we view them and our perspectives on them are important in what policies get passed on them. Yeah, civil inequalities economically connected to Black Lives Matter, correct. All right, so let's go on to the next slide. Oh, and by the way, this is a spread for the New York Times, and it's a great source, and yeah, you can kind of see some of COVID, some of the biggest issues, a Trumpless future it's hard to get your head around, and Biden, and the jobless aid, and just problems with our economy, and a lot of things that may have hit us personally. Maybe not super extreme as some other people, but we've all had impacts maybe on our family savings, and that's kind of some of the things that are major issues right now. And that's what critical debate really is and connects to, is personal things in your life. All right, so we should go on to the next slide. 1 second. All right, so these are some of the issues that you guys brought up. Some of them I think you missed was the removal of statues of historical slaveholders. Some of them are being actually removed, and I think some of them they're thinking about moving them to museums. I'm not really sure about that. Breakdown of international groups, I think Trump's decisions to withdraw from NATO. Hong Kong protests, threats of war with Iran, someone brought that up. I think someone said trafficking. I wasn't really sure about that one, but I can definitely see how you could tie that in to a critique about feminism or issues women's rights. All right, so critiques are something that lets us criticize things that we don't usually think of. For example, remember how I said it's usually about policy arguments. Usually if we pass this plan, then this will happen. But critiques say that's not the most important issue at hand, and we should use the debate space itself to actually create change or to advocate for things. And so an analogy that I find helpful for this is an excerpt from Franny Choi's Turing test. So Franny Choi is a queer writer, and a lot of her themes reflect on that. And so this is a poem she wrote, and it connects to debate because a lot of times in debate, people will choose to read poems or performance debate as something to actively endorse. So it's not an argument, but it's a way of saying, no, this is what the debate space itself is it's for these people, and we shouldn't just center just on policy making like that doesn't have impacts in the moment or won't actually impact the real world. This is something that we can impact the real world is by sharing our stories. So it's kind of a way to share stories, but then also tie it to an argument of what's most important in debate, what's most important in our educational spaces. So her poem, it was something I'm passionate about because I like poetry, so I was able to tie like my love for poetry and writing into debate. So I haven't actually done a performance debate myself, but this is something that debaters will do is they'll read a poem and it will connect to the argument they're making, or it will be the reason, like you should endorse this debater because they read this poem or because they brought up issues in advocacy and said something different. Or for example, different ways of doing this is like I've heard people say they did one where they like crawled on the floor and they used it to represent something with I think like Deleuze or just this other critical theorist, postmodern theory, or like blackballing words, or doing a rap that highlights like issues or like strengths in the Black community. So this is her talking about how her body and like the Turing test is a way to test if like a computer has like reached like, or like if people can tell whether or not like the computer is a person or not. And so the Turing test is kind of her way of saying like she identifies as like the computer, and like she kind of like shares her story, like she is like proving the Turing test, and it was how my interpretation of it. So it's a way of affirming her existence, and that's what critical debate is really a lot about. Okay, so for example, like I said, in many debates, arguments are centered around policy actions, and they don't really look at the on-standing issues or ideologies or perspectives surrounding those actions. For example, someone might say the SAT should be reformed to give students better methods, to give disabled students more time on the test. So this was a topic that I debated last year, and it basically says that the argument that my opponent who would make this argument would be saying is like, we can fix problems with the SAT, we can make it accessible to people who are disabled or differently abled students, but a critique of this would go on and say, no, that's not the fundamental issue with the SAT. This fundamental issue with the SAT is how it has a history and trends, and it's intrinsically ableist. And we say intrinsically, we can say that it can't be separated from the ableist roots and from how it discriminates against disabled students. So K-theory operates differently than a debate centered entirely on policy. It looks at the fundamental assumptions or beliefs surrounding certain policy actions and criticizes those as a reason to negate or affirm an argument. And usually critiques are on the negation, because someone will read an argument and then you will critique that argument, and it's more, I feel like it makes more sense to have a NAK than an AFK. Because if you read an AF, then you don't have anything to critique or link into in the first place. So what would a critique of increasing time for disabled students on the SAT be? So here is a card or a piece of debate evidence that I read last year. So the tag says, a system that quantifies and translates different disabilities into different levels of time accommodations never solves. Escobar 19. It puts the onus on students with disabilities to prove the need for extra time. It's impossible to pinpoint how much time a student with a disability needs in order for a test to be equitable. So it's basically saying that there's no way that we can translate people's disabilities into like time standards, how much time accommodation that they should get on the SAT. Because one of the main issues that came up with like people's criticism in the College Board is they're like, you don't give time to people who are differently abled. And for example, one of these examples that I read online is there was literally a student who didn't have like hands, and so he needed more time to be able to like fill in like the bubbles. But the way that it works is that like you're given a certain amount of time given on how they gauge how like disabled you are, and so that's how it translates into time. And what the critique is saying is that no, that's fundamentally wrong. What they're doing is like we can't translate people's different experiences or varied experiences into the amount of time that they should get, and it also ties into how standardized testing has been used to push differently abled or disabled students out of the classroom and into like separate classrooms where they don't get the same instruction. And so we see it how it's tied to a system of exclusion, and we see how standardized testing, for example, is tied to this idea that different races were more intelligent than others. And so we can see that there are intrinsic issues with it. And what you would be arguing is saying that like those issues can't be overcome and the system like needs to be scraped. Like that's something that is so tied into the identity and why it was created in the first place, that how do we clearly like get out of that with like these small reform changes that just hide like the actual root of the problem, and like they just like conceal that and they just work on like small things, but they don't actually like solve the actual problem. So there are different types of critiques. There are critiques of assumptions and critiques of certain words and critiques of the debate space. And this is just a very simple way of thinking about critiques and separating them. So critiques of assumptions, like arguments, specifically like the arguments they make that have assumptions, you critique those. Another would be like critiques of certain words they use. For example, if they use ableist language or like they position women as special victims. An example of this would be like the US ought to intervene in the Middle East because like look at like all these like poor like Middle Eastern women, and like they're like so abused, and like we need to like save them. And so it's like the like white savior, like male savior complex, and this is like why people are so interested in invading. And that's like this is the framework and the perspective that people have. Like maybe it doesn't come out on paper, maybe they're not saying like this is specifically, but you can see it in the wording and the language that they use, is that it's mostly about like positioning like Middle Eastern women as helpless and in need of like white saviors. Another one is critiques of the debate space itself. So this is a pretty like frivolous critique, but an example I came up with is critiquing someone for wearing like a suit. So a lot of time in debate, people like go in and they wear like super fancy suits and stuff. And a critique of that would be like you would go in the round and you critique your opponent for doing that, because this kind of creates this inequity where like people with like have like greater means can like afford to like buy nicer things and look better. And like a lot of debate is in presentation and how people perceive you. It's really clearly shown that like women do a lot worse than men just because they're perceived as being like screechier. And so you can actually see that in the outcomes in the debate space itself, where like men are more likely to be like voted up and speaks and like voted the winner based on that. So do you have any questions right now? And also feel free to just pop in with questions. I know I'm going really fast because I feel like dinner time is like coming up for people, so I don't want to take that time from you. So what are the different parts? Oh, how do you run a critique? Yeah, we're getting onto that. And sorry, I kind of took like the segue around like it because I wanted to like connect it to certain things in people's lives and how it like connects to that. I guess I can go a little bit more into how like the connection is. For example, you can look at issues like the Black Lives Matter movement, and there's a specific critique on or related to movements of social progress like Black Lives Matter that Vasan will be teaching later this week that I highly recommend you attend if you've kind of been interested in Black Lives Matter and you want to get like some of the critical theory on ideas of like social progress and like what the Black community and like leaders and thinkers in that like theoretical or critical theorists think that like what's the best course of action. So yeah, how do you run a critique? So in debate, usually the affirmative will make an argument and you will link into that argument, and that's what the link is. So for example, my earlier example was about ableism and how maybe the debater in the other argument says something about how we're just going to reform like the time and switch that into like more disabled students will get more time on their tests. And the link would be that like you can't, that's like ableist because you can't like translate people's disabilities into like time. And there's a whole other like warrants for that that tie into like the history of standardized testing being really messed up. But another thing, there are different links too. A link for the Afro-pessimism would be an argument that makes a case that social progress can be made. And I think a link there would be saying you're giving false hope to people that social progress can be made, which I knew is like kind of counterintuitive. Another thing would be to say that another critique of like social progress would be something saying like, there's a lecture I'm going to teach later called like the Bodiake, and it basically says that like society is so centered like around like there's no longer anything real left, that we can't create social progress because like everything has been replaced by science. Anyway, I'm not going to go deep into that, but a lot of them links into critiques. Another one is like the model minority K, which just says that um, that like it hurts Asian Americans to be situated as like the model minority, and it's also like harmful to other minorities. Have any of you heard of that argument? I think some of you might have heard it in your classrooms, possibly from some teachers. I can go over it a little bit later, but I'm not sure. We're not going to be offering that argument. Okay, so moving on, impact. So the impact is the next part of the argument, and it says like, what are the implications of your argument? So what does it mean? How is translating disability into sets of time ableist, and what is the end impact of doing that? So it could be that it leads to more disabled students being pushed out of classrooms where they don't get the same access to resources. A way of thinking of this is, yeah, like some people do need like more time in outside classes, but a lot of times we find that isn't the case, and they're just moved out of classes when they could stay in the class with like an aide, or they could just stay in the class by themselves. And so the standardized testing is like inherently limited. That's an argument. And then the alternative is something you do in the round, and this is what makes critiques distinct from policy arguments or any other argument you've heard, is that you say something, you say like the role of the ballot. So the ballot is something that the judge writes on and says why you won like the round. But there's something called framework in debate, which basically is you setting out like how you win. And it's really, everyone needs to have framework because it shows like how the judge should measure the round. And it seems like it should be plain to say like the judge should just measure the round on the best debater, but there are certain metrics for that, and you need to make like the metrics kind of in your favor. And so you should say the role of the ballot or your framework of this debate should be not on hypothetical policymaking, which is what your opponent is doing. They're saying like we should just have the College Board like expand or give more access to disabled students to have more time increase. What you're saying is that instead we need to endorse the debater or abolish the system that is intrinsically messed up. So one of the arguments in Go is that the argument that they make has no real world implications, and your argument does have real world implications in that you're like actually reading it in the debate space. For example, people will read like poems, or they'll read advocacies, or like narratives, and it like wakes people up and they're like, oh, this is like a perspective I've never heard before. So you're like trying to actively change people's mind, and like you are actively communicating with them versus like you saying something about like some like policy made like in like the US federal government, which you have like no control over. I know that's a lot to go through. Okay, but then how does that work if you randomly assign sides every round? Yeah, so you actually prepare arguments for both sides. And so you could have a K argument on one side and then a policy argument on the other. I usually, like, a lot of times I find that you can make K arguments for both sides, like the same K argument for both sides of the debate. You just link it differently and you might still have the same impact, but how you tie in is different. So yeah, okay, so first off, you have like two arguments. So you can run a K on one and then have a policy argument on the other. But like your framework for, oh, bye Krishna. Your framework like changes like per round too. Well, I wouldn't say like, isn't it like bad to say that you're going to spread awareness or something through advocacy and you should win based on that when you might be arguing the different side later on? Okay, yeah, okay, what you're saying. So basically like your like arguments on the affirmative and negative side, like they're not actively counteracting each other a lot of times. So you could literally run like the same type of K on both sides and you would literally be like advocating your whole time. You would just have different impacts. I can't think of a specific example right now, but it is possible. And because I think with a lot of like previous examples, they kind of show like this is like your pro side and this is your con side. But with the K, it gives you a lot of freedom to say like, this is how I link in on one side and this is how I link on the other. And this is how both sides are ableist. And like most of the time in debate, we learn that issues are often like really varied and we can make the same arguments and criticize a lot of the same things on both sides. So no side is perfect. Yeah. Okay, so how do I respond to a K? And so don't worry if you don't totally get the parts of the K, because we haven't really like gone through like the whole case structure, and you haven't actually seen a case, but you know that the different parts of it, there's the link, and then the impact, and then the alt. So there are different ways, and I'll just go quickly over these. You can perm the K, which just means that you can do the K, it's like permutation. You can do the critique and the plan. So if someone runs a K against you, your response will be like, there's nothing that is like mutually exclusive between the K and the argument that I'm running. Because a lot of the times Ks will say something like, we should like increase like advocacy for like or we should like decrease violence against women by like doing this. But then you can say like, I can still decrease violence against women by doing the plan. Like there's nothing. I think you would have to argue that you're not linking into the K while also saying that you can do it. So if it's a kind of a weak K, a lot of the times you can do that. No link is just the argument that they don't actually link into your K. So an example of this could be you could be reading something about decreasing global violence through like trying to spread democracy, and they could be reading something saying that that's like intrinsically motivated by like this like white savior complex. But you could say like, where exactly, how does that connect? And if they're really vague, then you can kind of push the point that like they don't actually connect. For a lot of times, like you usually see like very strong wording where they talk about like gratuitous or like very like explicit violence against women as a reason to like go invade another country and like save them. Or not, like they don't frame it like that, of course, but like that's kind of what you link into there. Oftentimes they'll like have quotes or like hands like on evidence of like examples of like violent scenes, and that's not the same as saying like someone was sexually assaulted. But if they use like graphic imagery, then that is what you're criticizing. So if you don't use graphic imagery, you can say like, no link. Where did I ever like link into your K? Where did I ever like fall into the we need to invade because like we need to save kind of complex? Another way to argue against a K is to use another K. So one of the critiques I ran this year was feminist international relations, and it basically says that war is like hypermasculine, and like hypermasculinity is the root of war. So hypermasculinity is like this like desire to like kind of like push. For example, I use with like nuclear warheads. The language surrounding how leaders talk about nuclear war is often like centered in very like what should I say? It's very like centered on like, oh, mine's bigger than yours, kind of that kind of talk. And so you can say like that's like the root cause of war. But another way to a K versus K argument would be, no, you're like recreating gendered constructs, and you're like gender is violent. And we don't have a lot of lectures on that K right now, but if you come to like the high school or to this later meetings we have, probably we can talk about how a gender K and how like using FemIR might re-entrench the same like gender ideas, or like ideas that like women are like weak and like men are super masculine and things like that. Okay, and then the other thing is the alt doesn't solve. So a lot of times in Ks, like I said, people will be reading a performance debate, or they'll be saying something like the round should be voted on for who has the best advocacy, or who said something about like this, or who cares more about like feminist rights or like or women's rights, sorry. And then you would be saying like, okay, but like you don't actually do anything in the real world. And that's like a major issue with Ks, and a lot of times you have to like push them during cross-ex or cross-examination and say like, okay, but what exactly does your K do? And they'll be like, well, I'm bringing it, I'm talking to people in the round. But then your response would be like, well, you could have gone and given a speech somewhere else, and like, how does this impact, you're just talking to like one judge and then like one opponent. And that is the alt doesn't solve. Okay, so that's the slides I have now. I would like to do a quick drill, if people have time, to talk about different Ks or like critical arguments you can make in connection with the current events. So I'll go in a brief talk about some of the Ks lectures that you can attend, and I highly recommend that you attend the ones that interest you. I know we're doing critical queer theory, which is more on like queer experience, and then like interpreting. I know someone who ran like queer international relations, and I think it's about how like I'm not really sure, but I think his was like how queer people in America use it like queer people in America have more rights, that like that's the reason like we should like control these other countries because they don't give as much rights to like queer people and like we're better than them. So like that's like our policy is like hegemonic to or hedge against them or whatever. The other argument or like theory is Afro-pessimism. And it's this idea, I think Rudy, you were there, we talked about this idea of like social progress can't be created, and it's very pessimistic, thus the pessimism in the name. And it's this idea that social progress and giving people hope that social progress can be achieved is ultimately harmful, and like Black communities need to like separate into like themselves. And that's like Frank B. Wilderson. He actually is, I think he's in SoCal. He's like a professor there. I'm going to be talking about the Agamben K, which is a critique. It's kind of K literature in the sense that it's kind of about this idea of biopolitics and why certain things, for example, in the 19th century, people were very optimistic about like social progress. They're like, things are getting better. But then you saw in the 20th century, we had like the Holocaust and like World War II and like massive human rights violations. And so he creates this idea of like, there's always going to be like this other or this outlier created through defining the rules. We define who we are not. And that's what I'll go into with the Bourgeois K, the Agamben K. But those are some examples. I highly recommend you attend the Afro-pessimism one and the critical queer theory. I'm trying to think of the other ones. I think Lily will be teaching the set call K, which is just how we talk about the impact of settler colonialism and how it continues into this age. So I think we'll talk probably that's more on like US military bases in other countries. And how that kind of connects to colonialism, but also I think how like the US takes like indigenous land and stuff. And let's see. Oh, and then FemIR, or feminist international relations, is this idea that like international relations is like a study that is hypermasculine, and FemIR is like an alternative to this main like theory of how people think about international relationships and relations, and it's like a feminist theory of it. So in the context of, I'd like everyone to take maybe 5 minutes and think of something through a critical perspective. So this is a fundamental assumption. You could say something like, the people are saying we need to spend more money on police to train police, but then the critical perspective would be, and you might have seen this, I think on social media even, is like we need to defund the police because police are like intrinsically tied to like slave catching and like the history of that, and like the police state is itself anti-Black. So I know you can also brainstorm and like talk to me and field some questions off, but let's take a few minutes for that and then try to like come up with a K.